Wahide from NYU's Center of Latin American and Caribbean Studies, CLACS, again, for making this possible digitally, helping us organize the remote online forums, and really just helping out with the logistics and advertising of this event. We're especially grateful as well to Jens Andermann of NYU in the Spanish and Portuguese department, and the rest of the editorial board at the Journal of Latin American Cultural Studies, and especially to Isi Sadek, who has worked closely with us for their help, not only with the journal, but with pulling all of Pandemonio together, the previous two events and today's event as well. And finally, I just, both Javier and I, we really want to thank our 4 panelists who are with us today. All 4 of them warmly welcomed our invitation to join, share their research, and participate. And we're really thrilled and excited for the conversations we'll be having today. We wanted to invite 4 junior scholars whose work we see as really pushing the boundaries of cultural studies at the kind of the nexus, this interdisciplinary nexus of literature, history, queer studies, performance studies, postcolonial theory, critical race theory, and nation building. And we are just, extremely excited and very much looking forward to hearing what they have to share with us about each of their projects. So thank you all so much. We look forward to the conversation. And Javier is going to speak a little bit to the organization of today's event. It's going to be a 2-hour session, so we'll be done, by 2 p.m. Eastern time. And with that, I give it to Javi.
Thank you, Seth. So we'll start with the presentations by the panelists. Each of them is going to take approximately 15 minutes. I will be taking questions during the presentations if you want to post them in the chat or on the YouTube. And you can feel free to choose either language, any language, Spanish, Portuguese, or English. We'll be in charge of doing the translations as we read them out loud. We wanted to clarify that this is being live stream on YouTube, so we asked you that at the beginning during the presentations you turn off your cameras so you don't appear in the YouTube recording you don't want to, and then after the presentations you can turn on your cameras to pose your questions in person, unmuting yourself and turning on your camera. So before we go into the presentation, Seth and I wanted to talk briefly about how we got interested on the themes that articulate or structure this special issue, obscenity, censorship, and libidinal politics. In my case, this is an interest that emerged out of my research for my first book project, in which I was trying to trace the transnational circulation of social danger theory and queer cultures between Argentina and Spain in the second half of the 20th century. And then going to the archives, I realized that the institutional archives that hold official records, such as military records, judicial records, depositions, affidavits, etc., constitute pornographic archives. And that pornography is something that the authorities were demanding in a very forceful way. They were asking for testimonies that were super explicit in terms of ejaculation, who swallowed the semen of whom, and so on. So I was very struck by that experience of being an institutional archive in which obscenity was produced or demanded by the authorities, and then archive as a way of neutralizing or containing the danger of dissemination. And then I'm interested in the kind of political engagements with the archives that we can enact in the present to promote a kind of reversal of that containment. So I'm also collaborating with digital platforms and activist collectives such as Moléculas Malucas, trying to trace the counter-narratives that queer and trans communities produce through their own erotica and archiving practices. And with that, I'm going to pass the word to Seth.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. So just a little bit, really quickly for everybody, we hope that several of you have been able to listen to this short podcast conversation between Javier and me. It's bilingual, Javier speaking Spanish, I'm speaking English. We've also recorded an all English version, which we ended up not uploading, but if anybody's interested, feel free to get in touch with us afterwards and we can send you that, that file. But really, what we talk about in that podcast is sort of a longer version of the last 2 minutes Javier presented and the 2 minutes I'll present right now. my own work, I'm a historian of colonial Latin America, and I first came to notice obscenity in the archives through the terminology of obscenidad in a series of sodomy and pecado nefando, or nefarious sin, inquisition and criminal cases from the from the colonial archives of Mexico and Guatemala, largely. And it was really kind of as I was finishing my first book on the sins against nature in New Spain, that I started to think about the shifting contours, historical and technological contours of obscenity as we move forward in time from the 18th century into the 19th and the early 20th century. So my current project, research project, which I hope will culminate in a monograph and an open access digital archive, is called Archiving the Obscene, Censorship and Pornography in Latin America from 1700 to 1955. And as with Javier, this is a project that's really sort of thrust me into the world of flea markets, of book dealers, of private collectors, and of institutional and grassroots archives. So a big part of this project is around the sort of the collaboration and assembly, and I would say collaborative, piecing together of a corpus of archival records, ephemeral records that speak to histories and often neglected histories of gender and sexuality in Mexico and also in other parts of Latin America. So today's panel with our 4 speakers is conceptually connected to a forthcoming special issue of Journal of Latin American Cultural Studies, co-edited by Javier and me, on the topic of obscenity, censorship, and libidinal politics in Latin America. And in this special issue, as with today's iteration, we're particularly interested in exploring interdisciplinary approaches to better understand the shifting political, cultural, and technical contours of what gets defined as obscene, and how censorship works in relation to state politics, aesthetics, and forms of popular activism. And with that, I really just want to open this event by kind of pointing to this much longer historical genealogy of pornography as a term, as a concept, and as a classification, and the obscene. Pornography, by all means, is a relatively modern concept that originates in many ways in the 19th century, though with much older roots globally. And here I just want to briefly turn to a quote that I love by Lynn Hunt, whose edited 1993 book, The Invention of Pornography, Obscenity and the Origins of Modernity, 1500 to 1900, I think is really thought-provoking in terms of how pornography in the past connects to pornography as a form of social, political, and religious critique in the present. So Lynn Hunt writes in the introduction to that book, pornography, quote, "Pornography was not a given. It was defined over time and by the conflicts between writers, artists, and engravers on the one side, and spies, policemen, clergymen, and state officials on the other. Its political and cultural meanings cannot be separated from its emergence as a category of thinking, representation, and regulation. Early modern pornography reveals some of the most important nascent characteristics of modern culture. It was linked to free thinking and heresy, to science and natural philosophy, and to attacks on absolutist political authority." End quote. And to this sort of this list, I would add, and this is what we'll see a lot today, critiques of, I would say, morality of the day, critiques of religiosity. What this panel today is so interested in is thinking about how, what gets classified as obscene or as pornographic oftentimes functions, from the early modern period into the present as a vehicle to critique the states, to critique moralizing campaigns. And as we'll see today, pornography, obscenity, and the explicitly eroticized body functions as a vehicle to critique dictatorships, populist political figures, racism and racist interventions, and historical monuments that champion colonization, among many other fields. So with that, again, thank you to everybody who made this event possible, and especially to our 4 speakers. And I'm going to move now just to introduce our first speaker, Maria Seari. The title of her paper is Bésame por favor, uses of obscenity to denounce violence in Incontables. And Maria, thank you for being here. Maria was born in Venezuela, raised in New York City, and is currently an assistant professor in gender, women's, and sexuality studies at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. She received her PhD in ethnic studies from the University of California, San Diego, and a master's degree in women, gender, and sexuality studies from Ohio State, and another MA from Hispanic Languages and Literatures from the Stony Brook University. Maria's current book project is Uncovering the Virgen del Panecillo, Quito's Neo-Colonial Urban Transformation and Decolonial Future Imaginaries. And this is a project that examines the political and symbolic importance of how the monument of La Virgen del Panecillo in a cultural research study of how public monuments come to represent and often reproduce imaginations that come to be mapped onto national territories. And Maria, one of Maria's more recent publications is titled From La Virgen del Panecillo to La Virgen del Legrado, Transnational Feminist Struggles for Reproductive Rights in the Andes, that was published in the fall of 2020 with Frontiers, a journal of women's studies. And with that, I pass the baton off to you, Maria. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Seb, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to share my screen first. Okay, that's where I want to be. Thank you everyone for being here. A special thank you to Javier and Seb for organizing this panel, and thank you to my fellow panelists for sharing virtual space with me. I really do wish we can meet in person. Today's talk is part of a larger work in progress, like Seb said, titled Bésame otra vez, Use of Obscenity to Denounce Violence in Incontables. So I'll start. Chilean queer author and artist Pedro Lemebel is internationally recognized for his crónicas, among them the well-known De Perlas y Cicatrices, Loco Afán, La Esquina es mi corazón, Adiós Mariquita Linda, among other of his work, but it was his short stories that caught my attention early on in my academic career. Under his paternal name Mardones, Pedro Lemebel wrote his first book of short stories, Incontables, back in 1986, towards the end of Augusto Pinochet's 17-year dictatorship. They were packaged into paper bundles. You can kind of see the package towards the top of the screen. They were packaged into paper bundles and were covertly distributed due to the extreme political repression and anti-regime censorship of the time. In 2018, just 3 years after Lemebel's death, his first work of fiction was officially published, and you can see the copy from Seix Barral at the bottom of the screen. In the editor's note, Lemebel describes how he hid his stories like hijos tontos for decades, although he knew that they were roaming around and eventually will make their way to the internet. Lemebel was correct. His stories were being passed around just as surreptitiously as they had been distributed back in 1986. I personally got a hold of them back in 2009 as a grad student. And more than a decade later, I'm still fascinated by the story's obscene content of violence, sex, and queerness. In today's talk, I explore the use of sexual obscenity and extreme forms of violence to argue that these forms of the grotesque challenge social political definitions of obscene as purely sexual or tied to the body. The stories in Incontables demand that state repression and political violence be recognized as obscene and be seen as worthy of social and legal condemnation. So I analyzed 2 out of the 7 stories that make up Incontables, Bésame otra vez forastero and Bramadero. And I explored juxtaposing definitions of obscenity in today's talk. First, I consider the potential of obscenity as excess, or that which the state has tried to at best hide and at worst eradicate. Obscenity in this case means overt sexuality, excessive racialized and sexualized bodies, dirty sex in dirty places, sex for money and pleasure, and not reproduction. Excessively grotesque characters like the vieja in Bésame otra vez forastero defy the limits of obscenity, and in doing so showcase the ways that liminality exists as spaces of and for resistance. On the other hand, because Incontables were written as satires of the dictatorship, literally as the untellable tales of the regime, lo incontable, they encapsulate a different understanding of obscenity that I'm really interested in. This version is also filled with filth, bodily fluids, and unspeakable tales of sexual excess, but rather than being condemned by the state, showcase the atrocities of state violence. The obscene violence suffered by characters like Prometeo in Bramadero represent the absurdity of the regime's power in its enactment of violence. Written in the midst of chaos, risking torture and death, Lemebel writes Incontables as a mean to weaponize the rage, hurt, and pain caused by the milicos in Chile. In my analysis, I consider the contradictions that modern obscenity law poses and suggests that the juxtaposition of sexual obscenity in Incontables to dictatorial violence, it forces the reader to account for violence as that which is truly dirty and immoral. The stories that I analyze are filled with descriptions of the oppressive atmosphere of the regime, while at the same time exposing pockets of sexual dissidence that escape the incessant eyes of the milicos, that seemingly everywhere seem to overlook the messages in the stories themselves. So Pia Barros recounts in the foreword to the newest edition that Incontables was written with a certain naivete that assumed that the milicos would not understand the twisted tales or were at the very least not avid readers. Barros, who worked closely with Lemebel throughout his whole career, describes Lemebel's excessive writing style as a political strategy. It's the writing style Lemebel is known for, also described sometimes as neo-barroso. She says, hablamos hasta agotar el toque de queda esa noche sobre las posibilidades de un lenguaje que pareciera tan bonito en su sonido y que sin embargo hablaba de cosas asquerosas y terribles. Lemebel's obscenely excessive language opens spaces of possibility to hide in plain sight, while at the same time rupturing the regime's discourse around order and morality. So let me start with Bramadero. Bramadero is a story about military violence, disappearance, sacrifice, torture. Bramadero translates to theatering post, or a post where an animal is tied to either be trained or killed. And this foreshadows the death of Prometheus' father. In the story, Prometheus' father pleads with his son to feign ignorance when the guards come looking for him because he's being sought out for being an insurgent. Bote estos papeles donde nadie los encuentre, porque un certificado de nacimiento con ese apellido es una sentencia de muerte. Huyendo de Bramadero, no sé cuántos días, cuántos caminos crucé en la noche, que es como un círculo negro de años, huyendo, quemando fotos y papeles. Prometeo acts faithfully as he pretends to have no memories of his past, his father, or his lineage. He acts so faithfully, in fact, that his memories actually begin to fade away. By the end of the story, Prometeo has had to sacrifice, in the most violent of ways, any memories of his family. He burns any documents that connect him to his family, flees his home to find refuge in a small and dirty hut in which his only companion is a small faded statue of a saint he has recovered from the garbage. The crudely grim circumstances in which Prometeo lives, a hut he has made home after running away from Bramadero, is dirty, smelly, and squalid-like. At the same time, it is the filth in which he lives that protects him from the guards that come crashing into the home, pinching their noses because of the smell. They assume he's too demente to even recognize his own mother. Deborah Vargas, in her study of Lo Sucio as queer analytic, examines how neoliberal notions of individualized cleanliness are always juxtaposed to the failures of populations that are deemed dirty and wasteful because they live in impoverished neighborhoods and overcrowded homes. The threat of contamination that surplus populations represent for being lo sucio holds potential for the ability to resist being, if not disciplined, then eradicated. Prometeo survives as testament that lo sucio cannot be eradicated, even with all of the violent tools of the state. He survives and remains both as the silent threat to the dictatorship and a silent threat to the neoliberal democratic state, which will undoubtedly offer no respite for the violent ways that he has been forced out of his home, his memories erased, and his social worth taken away. The milicos ultimately leave Prometeo alone and do not violently interrogate him like we would normally see. But by leaving him because of the conditions he is living in, it is also a necropolitical decision to leave him to die in the conditions that he's living in. In the story, state violence extends from physical torture to what Akil Membe describes as the sovereign's power to let die by creating death worlds that lead to untimely death. Death worlds are, quote, new and unique forms of social existence in which vast populations are subjected to conditions of life conferring upon them the status of living dead. Lemebel exposes that which the state tries to elide, the obscenity of state violence in its ability to extend outside of the law by creating the conditions of possibility for bare life. At the same time, while Lemebel exposes the grotesque reaches of state violence, he also foregrounds survival as resistance. Like the Greek mythological figure Prometheus, Prometeo sacrifices himself for his father and for the broader insurgent community in Pramadero. Prometheus is the titan who steals fire from Zeus and then gives it to the humans. He is punished for stealing fire by being bound to a rock, like a theatering post for animals or a bramadero, while a giant eagle eats his liver every day just to have it grow back again the next day. Although Prometheus sacrifices his body for humankind, he is not portrayed as a sacrificial lamb. He is described as cunning, intelligent, and as having foresight. Prometeo is regarded as opposite of intelligent by the milicos, but it is his foresight and his ability to camouflage that ensure his survival. While he indeed loses his memory, he is one of the few survivors of state violence that will be able to piece together the accounts of the regime. The very fact that he cannot be obliterated, even when his memory can, is testament that where there is violence, there is also resistance. And the resistance often exists not just in the act of survival, but in the persistence to continue on living. Prometeo is the anti-hero that Lemebel has always been fond of in his work. He is not there to win. He's not there to be victorious. There is no way to escape his peripheral position, which is why he chooses to utilize his subservient position in order to resist the milicos. Similarly, the vieja in Bésame otra vez forastero is the anti-heroine of Incontables, and she's one of my favorite characters too. As destitute as Prometeo, La Vieja escapes the purview of the state due to her seemingly insignificant nature. Her life, while salacious in terms of her sexually illicit encounters with young men, is not as obscene as the way in which she is socially abandoned. Bésame otra vez forastero is the last story of Incontables, and it tells the story of an old and decrepit woman who is known in the barrio for luring young men into her house and turning them into men. The narrator of the story is one of the many men that has had his first sexual encounter with the vieja, as he remembers her many years later after her death, when he thinks he can hear her heels clicking down the pavement as she calls him. The grotesque demeanor of the vieja, de-virginizing the young boys who frighteningly enter her home, is a critique of normative female beauty, socially acceptable adolescent sexual encounters, and heteronormative sex and sexuality. This story is about bringing to life the stories of Santiago's most forgotten spaces, a street corner, an alley, an old forgotten women's home. While any remnants of the vieja's existence fades, she comes to life in the story through a reconstruction of the narrator's memories. Obscenity in the story functions not so much in how the old woman tries to lure young men into her lair, so much as the description of the vieja and the boy's curiosity to know what she hides inside. The reader, perhaps mortified, is also made to feel just a little bit curious as the young men, continuing to read to see what happens next. She's described multiple times as a spider woman who weaves a web to trap her men. Sola y hambrienta teje su telaraña azul. She's also described as old and deceased, with eyes half closed, lifting her skirt as she walks down the stairs, calling to the boys that walk past her house to come inside and kiss her. Bésame, repite accesando. Bésame, por favor, mi muchacho, mi niño hermoso. More outrageous is the boy's desire to enter her home, and as the narrator closes his eyes, he can imagine her chicken eyes following a frightened boy on a bike who rides faster away from her, but ultimately intrigued by his own desire, enters her home. The description of the vieja is juxtaposed to the youth of the men in the story, which represent the new generation of Chile. This new generation stands in the liminal spaces between remembering and forgetting. While the vieja's surreal demeanor and the way she sexually engages with the young men is indeed obscene, what is shocking about the story is how the figure of the vieja threatens to disappear, and with her the many stories of the street only she will remember, such as the death of her grandparents, the ways that coffins were often taken down through people's windows, midnight cries, and so much more. The vieja only exists in the narrator's memory, which resurface when he hears her heels clicking. The heels help him revert back to a time when this prohibited and deviant space was available to him. She represents past and present to the narrator. This representation of memory disrupts normative formations of nation-state memory making because she survives not through documents, photographs, or official testimonies, but rather through childhood recollections of contrived sex abuse and deviance. The quotidian life of the vieja is the memory of the barrio. She's the memories of seduction, lewd sexuality, and violence. The vieja and Prometeo do not pose a direct threat to the regime because their poverty renders them insignificant. So much so that the vieja's body is not even recovered until 3 months after her death in her home. At the same time, characters like the vieja possess a lot of power in the everyday lives of the youth of the barrio. She has the power of arousing desire, articulating fantasy, manipulating sexual deviance, and for the narrator, the vieja has the ultimate power of awakening memory. So in a very quick conclusion, I juxtapose Bramadero and Bésame otra vez forastero because while these two stories could not be more different, they both tell the untellable tales of Pinochet's violent military regime. They recount the ways in which people lived in fear of state violence and repression and were socially and economically abandoned by the state, while at the same time finding ways to survive, even when the state wanted to eradicate their existence. The stories showcase the obscenity and extent of state violence. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Maria, for that fantastic presentation. I'm doing the applause on behalf of everyone that is on the audience. Now I'm going to introduce you to Rob Franco. Robert Franco holds a PhD in Latin American history from Duke University and currently is a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Women, Gender and Sexuality Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. His book manuscript is tentatively titled Revolución en las Sábanas or Revolution in the Sheets, Sexuality and Tolerance in the Mexican Left, 1991 to 2001, and examines the fraught and sometimes hostile relationship between the Mexican left and issues of sexuality and sex. His articles have also been published in the Radical History Review and the Journal of the History of Sexuality, touching on themes such as disability and transgender politics in Mexico, the global history of HIV/AIDS, and the scandal of the Baile de los 41 or Dance of the 41. And with that, I'm going to pass the word to you, Rob, and mute myself and turn off my video.
Muchísimas gracias, Javi and Zeb, for inviting me to present today. And I'm really honored to be presenting with my fellow panelists. So let me just quickly share my screen. And so my talk today is going to be on a recent scandal that many of you probably heard about in Mexico City. So on December 10th, 2019, roughly 200 protesters from various campesino organizations stormed Mexico's Palace of Fine Arts, or Bellas Artes, to denounce Fabian Chavez's 2014 painting La Revolución, pictured here. So the image, as you can see, depicted the revolutionary icon Emiliano Zapata with several artistic liberties, which included a seductive feminine figure, a pair of revolver-shaped high heels, and a pink sombrero as he sits astride a very aroused horse. And though it was painted 5 years earlier in 2014, Revolución gained notoriety when it was featured on the promotional materials for the exhibit Emiliano Zapata After Zapata, or Zapata Después de Zapata, commemorating the centenary of his death in 2019. So just as a quick reminder, Emiliano Zapata was the famed mestizo general who rose up against the dictator Porfirio Díaz to demand land redistribution during the Mexican Revolution. Assassinated in 1919 by political rivals, Zapata instantly became a martyr for the cause of revolutionary struggle. And though his memory was appropriated by the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or the PRI, during its 7 decades of one-party rule, Zapata's legacy was never the exclusive domain of the government. His image has been taken up by diverse movements, including feminist and decolonial struggles, like the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, or the EZLN. And those Zapata's face can be found on merchandise ranging from t-shirts to tote bags on Etsy. Revolución catalyzed an explosive debate about obscenity, censorship, and the depiction of national figures in artistic works. In particular, protesters denounced Zapata's depiction as gay. Zapata's grandson Jorge, for example, stated that doing so to depict him as gay was denigrating to his memory. This libidinal energy of the protest soon devolved into physical violence. Tenant farmers blocked the entrance of the museum for several hours, with some demanding that the painting be burned. And when confronted, they proceeded to attack and injure photographers, journalists, and supporters of Chaves. Though the descendants of Zapata threatened to sue the museum, they eventually arrived at an agreement with the Ministry of Culture. So in the end, the painting could be exhibited, but it was barred from being used in any promotional material. And Zapata's family members were also permitted to place a plaque next to the work that stated their disapproval. And the protests in the end gave the painting even greater notoriety because it was acquired shortly after by the Spanish businessman Daxto Bennett to join his private collection of other censored pieces of art. So the scandal over the painting highlights something that I had long noticed in the debate over Zapata's memory. For years since his death, rumors have circulated that Zapata had same-sex sexual affairs with various men. And his relationship with people like Ignacio de la Torre, son-in-law of the president Porfirio Díaz, has gained particular scrutiny in recent years, and has led to the idea that Zapata was a sort of proto-gay figure. Meanwhile, popular and historical interpretations of Zapata really emphasize him as an icon of Mexican masculinity and machismo. So as a result, we have this binary around Zapata's private life. One side insists on his heterosexual masculinity, while another has appropriated him as a figure, as a gay man. So let me show you what I mean. In response to the affair, hundreds of artists came together on social media in support of Chaves, posting their own quote unquote gay drawings of Zapata. Many of these called Zapata gay or queer. They use those kind of hashtags, and they connected him to an international struggle for LGBT rights. So these are a few. They photoshopped his face onto Freddie Mercury's body, kind of transnationalizing him in that way. One kind of does some Illuminati style of artistic work. On the other side of the debate, we have campesinos and Zapata's descendants decrying his depiction as gay or in this way and insisting on his masculinity. As the late musician and supporter of the rioters, Armando Manzanero, stated, quote, "It is the most disgraceful and unjust thing one could do to one of our heroes. Instead of heels, they should have painted him with huge balls, or huevos bien grandes." So in these polemics, Zapata is either a homophobic symbol of nationalism and mestizo identity, or a transnational queer icon whose relationships to indigenous and mestizo women are erased and overlooked. And I always ask, what about his potential bisexuality? What about the considerations of bisexuality? And I argue that this binary of the symbol of nationalism and the transnational queer icon censures the bisexual potential of Zapata and elides the intersection of race, class, and sexuality that is central to his erotic legacy. So let me get into what I mean by that. The split over Zapata's sexuality constitutes what the legal scholar Kenji Yoshino has termed, quote, "the epistemic contract of bisexual erasure," that requires heterosexual and homosexual investment in the stability of a binary system of sexual categories. So bisexual erasure can thus be a conceptual tool that gets at the erotic tensions that elicit censure in Zapata's erotic legacy. And why is this? So Robin Oakes defines bisexuality as the potential to be attracted romantically and or sexually to others of varying genitalia and or varying genders, not necessarily at the same time, not necessarily in the same way, and not necessarily to the same degree. So as this floating signifier, bisexuality has often been characterized as apolitical, multifarious, and unrestrained. And these characterizations of distrust are most often applied to feminized and racialized subjects of the global South, who are seen as quote unquote primitive and stuck in a stage of underdevelopment. For example, Latin American men who engage in sex acts with other men while married to women are seen as quote unquote pre-modern and resistant to a true sexual identity, remaining perpetually in the closet. I also want to note that the expansive and more popular use of the term queer to signify bisexual acts and desires does the same work of censoring and erasing bisexuality. So by taming and encompassing bisexuality under an umbrella of sexual diversity, the use of queer really masks bisexuality's emphasis on physical sex acts and pleasures that are constitutive of bisexual desire. So I want to clarify that I'm not applying a Western sexual identity category of bisexual to Zapata. Instead, I want to embrace the kind of radical, multifarious methodological potential of bisexuality as a tool to historicize the desire to know through years of rumor and speculation what is essentially Zapata's unknowable sexuality. And I ask us to consider how censorship is more than the decision to remove an obscene or erotic image from the public sphere, but also a historical act of erasure of bisexual sex acts in favor of a homo-hetero-binary of sexual identity that cleanses the legacy of historical figures so they may be made into tools of the state and nationalism. By emphasizing bisexuality in Zapata's memory, I push for the recognition of a plurality of sexual pleasures that resist what Claire Hennings calls the globalized mandates and colonial dictates of sexual identification and decency, which often fall into the traps of hypermasculinity or homonationalism. Emphasizing Zapata's potential bisexual desires refutes the homophobic masculinity that we saw come out at the protests. This masculinity has been constructed over years by historical literature that has evaded or ignored the question of Zapata's sexuality, alongside the use of Zapata's image by the Mexican government and others. So just one look at the photos that most circulate of Zapata really exemplifies this nationalism that refutes femininity and sexual diversity. So the image on the left here is this kind of homosocial space that it's one of the most famous images of Zapata meeting with Villa. Even though, and this refutes that kind of desire of femininity, even though Zapata himself was quite a bit of a dandy and was very careful of his self-presentation, as we see on the right. So instead of a cleaned up image of a masculine revolutionary, I think thinking with bisexuality, we have a Zapata that subverts normative regimes of sexual desires that emphasize restraint and respectability. Characterized as needy, greedy, and demanding, bisexuality can signal a carnal nonconformity that really undermines these attempts at decency politics that cleanse and erase the sexual past of historical figures. At the same time, returning a bisexual lens to Zapata also recognizes that he had sexual relations with women, not only his wife, but numerous other women that led to over a dozen children out of wedlock. From feminists to EZLN members, Zapata has been this vital figure for demands of gender justice and equality. So it's no surprise that many of the protesters were campesina women, as we see here. So while the protesters demand that Zapata's sexual morality be restored to the status of hypermasculinity and heterosexuality, the camp of Chavez supporters focused on a queer image of Zapata that aligned him with a globalized sexual modernity. So some of the images I showed you earlier really emphasize this kind of cosmopolitan Zapata, right? Others, however, not only overlook his relationship to indigenous and mestiza women, but also even his racial background. So look at these works, for example. So Zapata is sometimes either white or light-skinned in these artistic depictions, and he's depicted in a way that upholds a kind of Eurocentric ideal of beauty, muscular. And so I think, as we can see, the debate about Zapata is not exclusively a disagreement over the details of his sexual past. It's also a revival of really age-old divides in Mexico over class, race, and geography that seek to either strengthen the ties between heterosexuality and nationalism by centering Zapata's family, or to make him an international queer icon that seemingly erases his raced body and undermines his ties to indigeneity, to mestizaje, and to women. In the end, I think bisexuality's threat can be productive. Emphasizing bisexuality's ability to subvert normative regimes of sexual desire embraces what Deborah Vargas has termed lo sucio, the lewd, obscene, and undisciplined behaviors that oppose respectability and comportment. To undermine the attempts at decency politics and the elision of sexual plurality, I argue that in my paper that I'm writing that we must embrace lo sucio. This includes the idea of Zapata's carnal sex acts with a plurality of people, or just embracing the possibility of it, that it resists bisexual erasure and makes Zapata disloyal to state-led and machista appropriation. So overall, bisexuality refutes the suturing of sexual respectability with the glorification of a revolutionary past. And I'll end there. Thank you.
I too offer applause for the large group in front of us. Thank you so much, Rob. That was really great. So perfect. On to our third speaker is Inés Uedraogo. The title of whose paper is Fuck the Fascism, Maria Basura's Revenge on European Colonialism. And Inés graduated in July of 2020 with a PhD in Hispanic Cultures and Literatures from Boston University, and also received 2 graduate certificates, one in Women, Gender and Sexuality Studies, and the second in African Studies. And Inés's dissertation was titled Devouring the Patriarchy, Anthropornophagy and Pleasure Politics in Brazilian Pop Porn Festivals. And this is a dissertation that analyzes a series of sexually explicit films and sort of post-porn political films screened at the Brazilian Film Festival in São Paulo in 2017. And that blends cultural, gender and sexuality studies with a really nice, I think, intersection of critical race theory and post-colonial theory. And just to sort of say, I've read the dissertation, I really appreciate Inés's framing and theorization, a sort of coining of this term, anthropornophagy, which is sort of a take on you know, the anthropophagic manifesto. So. And Inés is currently teaching Introduction to Latin American and Caribbean Literature at Suffolk University and a seminar on love and eroticism at Emerson College. So thank you so much, Inés.
Thank you, Zed. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's a privilege, really, to be sharing a piece of my work with you. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint. The conversation that we're going to have today is a very small piece of the work that Zed briefly mentioned in the dissertation. I'm not going to enter in the conversation about anthropornophagy. I'm going to focus on the performance of Maria Basura. And with that said, and I also wanted to say that I will be showing you a brief excerpt of the short film that I'm discussing, Fuck the Fascism. And just a heads up that it does have explicit content. All right, so my presentation argues that the performance of disgusting sexual acts can retroactively punish the abuse of colonization and slavery. Fuck the Fascism is a self-produced short film by Latin American post-porn activist Maria Basura, as we can see her here. And it was created in 2016, and it aims at denouncing the economic and physical exploitation of indigenous groups in 19th century Europe, especially during the World Fair. Fuck the Fascism pretends to expose the real history behind the monuments that glorified genocide, tyranny, and slavery. Through the physical humiliation and material degradation of monuments, representing the heroes of European imperialism, Maria Basura seeks to bring awareness to a legacy built on theft, abuse, and blood, and transmitted by national heroes. This form of body activism is defined by Maria Basura as pornoterrorism, a form of radical political protest that combines sexual arousal with terror. Maria Basura, whose name unites the purity of the Christian name with the impure Spanish word for trash, blends her sexual acts with her outrage, stemming from the European colonial domination of indigenous populations. Spitting, masturbating, urinating on monuments erected after European colonizers constitutes a symbolic yet palpable revenge. And just to clarify the use of the word post-porn, it refers to, we can say, a transnational political and artistic movement that gathers a plurality of artistic and activist voices around non-normative sexual practices and their representation. And the goal of this type of artivism is to create, question, explore the possibilities, the sexual possibilities away from a heteronormative sphere and to seek the production of alternative anti-normative discourses on sexuality. So before I show you the excerpt, I want to read for you the manifesto that is present on the website of Maria Basura. And it says as follows: we come out to the streets, monsters, mutants, queers, sudacas, migrants, dissidents, those who wake up and want to wake up others, breaking down the walls imposed by this knowledge. We fuck back the glorified asses of fascist dignitaries, heroes of colonialism. We fuck them, and in the crime scene, we ejaculate real history on their stone bodies. And before I continue with the explanation, I'm sharing with you pieces of the short film that I'm going to be fast forwarding for the sake of time.
Las exhibiciones de pueblo constituyen en mi memoria una historia completa, muy rica en anécdotas y situaciones. Cuántas cabezas oscuras aparecen sonrientes en mis recuerdos. Cuántos aturdidos rostros, morenos o negros, que con ojos admirados contemplan la inmensa maravilla del mundo civilizado. ¿A dónde fuisteis a parar? Oh, vosotros, africanos, indios, vosotros, hijos del desierto, vosotros, esquimales y lapones, a quienes yo guié por el país de aquellos curiosos blancos que os contemplaban admirados, como si fuerais animales fabulosos. Todos habéis regresado hace largo tiempo a la tierra de vuestros antepasados, al país y el viaje al país del hombre blanco, que os hizo volver cargado de tesoros al hogar, ha llegado a constituir una grande e inolvidable aventura en vuestra historia.
So here she was reading and masturbating on the book of Carl Hagenbeck, who is one of the person who created a zoo in Germany in the 19th century and did bring indigenous groups from Latin America to Europe to display them. And after this, I'm going to fast forward and show you here where Maria Basura is preparing the revenge. And here is what she says.
Vamos a follar directamente del infierno.
Hemos llegado hasta aquí para buscarte, para violarte de vuelta. Vamos a expropiar todas sus riquezas y le vamos a dar por el culo fantasmal.
La selección de estas etnias las basaba en la cima.
All right, so that was it. I'm going back to the PowerPoint to keep going. All right, so so by placing her audience in a zone of discomfort, Maria Basura's performances push the limits of the politically correct and serve as a reminder that the obscene does not necessarily live in nudity or in sexual performance, but rather in the abuse and harm caused by colonization and capitalism on indigenous populations. Based on the manifesto, her blog entries, and the short film, the trash and vulgar style of Maria Basura's performances can be interpreted as an unapologetic revenge, as a ritual, one that seeks to make European political powers pay for the humiliation and the destruction of indigenous groups. Maria Basura's cultural identity sits among that of a feared and strong Malinche-like mestiza who is politically active and whose revenge takes place on the European ground. Basura's porno terrorist act starts with her wearing a strap-on dildo and raping Hagenbeck's stone monument. So later in the short film, Basura goes to the zoo and she enters and stands in front of the monument erected for Hagenbeck, and she rapes the monument with the dildo. From a performative stance, Maria Basura is using a dildo to force herself on the monument and adopts a male position by being the penetrator. Wearing a strap-on disrupts the heteronormative female gendered performance. She is the penetrating subject, and her power is tied to her performance as a whole and how she decides to use the phallic object. Maria Basura's body is central and works like a laboratory for experimentation with the use of technologies to modify it, like the strap-on dildo. She's also wearing a mask. She has a whip with her. And it becomes the central place for a social and political critique. After she penetrates the stone and the soil in front of Hagenbeck's stone, Maria Basura also uses the dildo to make herself regurgitate. She completes her porno-terrorist act by splashing what looks like blood and by urinating on Hagenbeck's stone. These disruptive acts constitute the message that Maria Basura sends to shake her viewers. Bodily fluids and Maria Basura's sex performance can offend, but what offends more is the simultaneous voiceover saying the following, and I quote, "Hagenbeck, his legacy and his family's fortune were built on blood, pain, and misery. Hagenbeck, murderer, abductor, wrongdoer, racist, supporter of slavery." The pornographic aspect of the queer performance causes disgust, discomfort, and temporarily aligns with the main anti-porn stance of porn being inappropriate, dirty, and offensive. And I will quote the following excerpt from Jack Halberstam's book. Heteronormative common sense leads to the equation of success with advancement capital, capital accumulation, family, ethical conduct, and hope. Other subordinate queer or counter-hegemonic modes of common sense lead to the association of failure with nonconformity, anti-capitalist practices, non-reproductive lifestyles, negativity, and critique. The negative affects express not only the refusal to conform with successful narratives in the hegemonic heterosexual and capitalist realm, but also the indignation of unacceptable practices such as colonization and indigenous exploitation. In Fuck the Fascism, low culture, ugliness, negativity, and failure are linked to the active protest of racism, heteronormativity, and anti-colonial fights and exploitation. Another question that emanates from this film is to which extent post-porn is moving away from a modern Eurocentric condition when considering that feminist movements in the US made possible post-pornographic performances today. In the words of Laura Milano, how can we appropriate post-porn so it becomes a powerful tool to eroticize and activate our sexual imaginary and not simply a colonizing dildo that penetrates implacably and invasively? These concerns are also echoed in Diana Pornoterrorista when she claims wanting to liberate individuals sexually so they become a stronger person to face the world, not as a European, not as a middle-class person, but as a human being. In Maria Basura's performance, through the raping of European men monuments, it is possible to witness the intention of pornoterrorism as decolonizing artivism, a bodily decolonization for normative sexuality and a mental decolonization for what Maria Basura calls fascism. The queer body is then the site of political messages, cultural experiments, and gender transformations. Pornoterrorism is thus this combination of sexual activity with a political message with the intention of shocking, offending. The trashier, the better to shake the audience, even though it does not reflect the level of prejudice suffered by the victims. Maria Basura adds to her pornographic performance in the Hagenbeck Zoo a terrorizing touch. She makes herself vomit on the monument, spills on it what looks like blood, and urinates on the monument. She's wearing a black and red balaclava, a black leathered bra with spikes. Like I said earlier, she holds a whip in her hands. to whip the stone monuments. This anger that Maria Basura is channeling through her porno terrorist performance could be characterized as a failure in the artistic realm, notably because it ensnares the viewer and it triggers unpleasant feelings and gut reactions. However, there's something to be said in the queering aspect of offensive art, such as porno terrorism. In his chapter called The Pathologization of Sexually Explicit Representation, Ruben Ogian analyzes arguments against artistic representations of the abject, coming from far-right families and religious associations, and some art critics as well, who share this catastrophic diagnostic. And I'm quoting, Ogian says, they, meaning the far-right groups, also contest this supposed shift toward the abject of contemporary art. They assume that art today is perverted by a vile tendency to move towards the most bizarre, monstrous, shocking, unbearable, a tendency that can only be explained by artists' desire to be noticed in a saturated market or to spark off the interest of a quickly wary audience. This could be one form of looking at Maria Basura's pornoterrorism, the disgust that her art can provoke, blending the pornographic with the abject, can be repulsive to the point that an audience cannot stand watching or can no longer appreciate the performance. Disgust, one of Tompkins' affects, has been actually often associated with pornography along with shame. According to Tompkins, and I quote, "Desire is oriented towards what is considered disgusting and shameful. At the same time, disgust serves as a distance between the subject and the object of disgust, but a distance that is tempting to reduce because the thing that disgusts and evokes shame also arouses, excites, and fascinates. Maria Basura's artivism has the ability to disgust and cause the viewer to feel ashamed for watching her performance. Artivism is not concerned about being aesthetically pleasing and conforming, but rather about sending a political message. Fuck the Fascism is not only a short film, but a project that started in 2015 and that is expanding. Maria Basura turned her artivism into a collective one. After, in the short film, she does invite the viewers to join this project and to also send some of their artivism and interventions. And I wanted to show you one of the interventions that she and another group of activists have done in Barcelona. This is another radical action that took place on October 12th of 2015, and to protest, right, the monuments erected for Cristóbal Colón. And this, I think, can be connected to more current interventions that have taken place in a lot of countries, such as the US, for example, not in a porno terrorist fashion, but nonetheless also protesting the issues with these monuments that are still erected until today, glorifying these colonizers, such as Cristóbal Colón. So to conclude, I will say the following. This invitation to create a porno terrorist action follows the tradition of the do-it-yourself porn and makes it a multifaceted project combining art, sexual exploration, and political action. At the end of the film is added the footage of Maria Basura, like I mentioned, with other activists in Barcelona doing this rally in front of Cristóbal Colón statue. And by damaging monuments, these artivists consider the epitome of white supremacy. They are actually desacralizing the untouchable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Inés. That was a super rich, thought-provoking presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now I'm going to introduce Irina Troconis. The title of her talk is French Kissing the Idol, Erotic Iconoclast and Political Subversion in Deborah Castillo, the Emancipatory Kiss. Irina is Assistant Professor of Latin American Studies in the Department of Romance Studies at Cornell University, and she holds a PhD in Spanish and Portuguese languages and literature from New York University, as well as a Master's in Latin American Studies from the University of Cambridge. She specializes on memory studies, Venezuelan studies, politics and performance, and digital humanities. She's currently working on her first book project titled Spectral Remains, The Politics of Memory in the Afterglow of Hugo Chávez's Bolivarian Revolution, exploring through the lenses of spectrality the memory narratives and practices developed around the figure of Hugo Chávez in the 6 years following his death. In that same book, she also examines the contemporary works of Venezuelan literature, film, and performance, engaging with and challenging the authority of the state's spectral gaze through the materiality of gender dissidence through the materiality and gender dissidence of bodies traditionally excluded from the narratives of the nation. She's also working on other 2 research projects. The first one examining the performance work of Venezuelan artist Deborah Castillo, which is related to the presentation today, and Violet Bull. The second project focuses on digital technologies as a form of intervention in contemporary Latin American fiction, film, and performance. Her publications have appeared in the Cuadernos de Literatura, Revista Latinoamericana, Trópico Absoluto, among others. So with that, I pass the word to you, Irina.
Thank you so much, Javier, and thank you, Seb, for the invitation to be here in this panel, sharing my work with colleagues whose work I find absolutely amazing. And I also want to thank the audience in advance for your questions, suggestions, and comments. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully that happens. There we go. All right. So the title of my presentation is French Kissing the Idol, Erotic Iconoclash and Political Subversion in Deborah Castillo's The Emancipatory Kiss. When I told Deborah Castillo that I was going to talk about the Emancipatory Kiss today, her answer was, "Really? Again?" And I laughed, we both did, but her response definitely got me thinking about why, from all her performances, and there are many, this one is the one that I keep going back to, finding different angles and approaches that would allow me to understand why I find it so provoking, and to articulate finally and clearly where its subversive power comes from. And as a warning to you, or as a disclaimer, I have yet to settle on an answer for this question. I am, as you will see, still thinking through this, and I am thrilled that I'm able to do it with you today. Another factor that perhaps has contributed to my insistence on returning to the Emancipatory Kiss are the recent efforts taking place in Venezuela, Castillo's home country and my own home country, here in the United States and in other places around the world, to dismantle dominant narratives and their powers to command allegiance by removing, vandalizing, and tearing down monuments and statues. Here in the United States, for instance, the horrifying death of George Floyd last May led to protests that included the destruction of a number of monuments and memorials associated with racial injustice. Similar actions occurred in the United Kingdom, where removal efforts and vandalism targeting memorials to figures involved in the transatlantic slave trade and British colonialism took place. In Venezuela, and you see this in the bottom 2 images, the worst economic and humanitarian crisis of the country's modern history has in the past few years led people to tear down statues of deceased President Hugo Chávez as a form of protest against the regime of Nicolás Maduro, his successor and current leader of the Bolivarian Revolution. These iconoclastic efforts, which we could tentatively think of as dynamics of demembering, underscore the fact that statues and monuments are not just commemorative objects occupying space. They are bodies, vibrant matter that exercise power rather than just represent it, and that in doing so, actively participate in the construction of the mnemonic, social, and political relations that are grounded on and that ground oppressive systems that dictate which lives are worth protecting and which aren't. This understanding of statues and monuments as bodies is central to Castillo's work. In fact, we could argue that the bodily nature of these objects of commemoration becomes particularly evident, palpable even, in performances like the Emancipatory Kiss, which, as the name anticipates, distinguishes itself from the iconoclastic efforts I mentioned, because instead of demolishing or vandalizing the statue in question, the golden bust of Venezuela's most important national hero, Simón Bolívar, It chooses to kiss it, a long, intimate, passionate kiss that triggers a reaction in the audience that is different, less legible perhaps than the rage and joy with which the destruction of a monument is typically celebrated or condemned. This, of course, doesn't mean that this kiss did not generate outrage, far from it. When the video of the performance was shown in 2013, a few weeks after Chavez's death, as part of the artist's exhibit titled Action and Cult, Castillo became the target of criticism, insults, and death threats. Particularly noteworthy was the segment of the pro-government television show Cayendo y Corriendo, and you see it on the screen, where the host, Miguel Ángel Pérez Pirela, accused Castillo of being a traitor to the nation of Bolivar and a puppet of the opposition, and called the performance a blatant act of disrespect against the memory of Bolivar and of Chavez, who had made Bolivar the symbolic center of the revolution. More than Pirela's specific comments, what I and others who have written about the emancipatory kiss tend to remember most and focus on is the viscerality of his anger. He acted as if Castillo's actions had offended him, a personal attack that exceeded ideological stances and the political polarization that has been shredding the country's social tissue for over 2 decades. And sure, we could argue that in a country where Bolivar is considered the father of the fatherland, the liberator of the nation, the hero above all heroes, it is to be expected that Castillo's actions would trigger such a visceral response. But is it? Because she is, after all, not destroying the golden bust, smashing it with a hammer, making it explode, or dismembering it. She will later on, but that's a story for another time. She's just kissing it. And while this is the first time she kisses Bolivar, it is not the first time her tongue controversially licks the surfaces of power. In her 2011 performance, La Mezuela, she kneeled down to lick the military boots of a soldier, an act that started as a performance and later became a virally reproduced stencil adopted as a symbol of resistance to the government's increasing authoritarian tendencies. 1 year after the emancipatory kiss, she licked the pages of books written by renowned Venezuelan poet Rafael Cadenas, and that same year, she also licked the pages of Elias Canetti's Masa y Poder. None of these objects, however, were busts, and in none of these actions did her hyperactive tongue disguise these frantic movements as a kiss the way that we see she does in the emancipatory kiss. Now, for Venezuelan historian Tomás Estraca, this kiss is a representation taken to the extreme, an extreme that becomes productively critical, of the excessive adoration and fetishization of Bolivar, both during and before Chavez's time in power. In Castillo's hands, this fetishization becomes absurd. As we witness the excess in the kissing, we must come face to face with the constructed nature of the cult of Bolivar and the dangers of blindly and naively entrusting his idealized and long-dead figure with the fate of the nation. This interpretation is doubtlessly valid and an accurate assessment of a practice that has become, for better or for worse, a defining element of our identity as a nation. But to me, Castillo's performance is about more than just Venezuela and the weirdly obsessive relationship we have with our national hero. The discomfort her performance generates is much more global than that. And I invite you to pay attention to it, to the cringing, to the looking away, to the willingness to stop already as you watch the video. And I'm just gonna stop quickly and share a little bit of the video by Castillo, so you also get a feeling for it. Here we go. All right, I'm gonna stop it right there, but feel free to keep watching it, and I'm gonna show you still of the whole thing. So let me get back to the PowerPoint. All right. We are here. All right. So each time I watch this video, I am reminded of a question that Michael Tausig asked in his iconoclasm dictionary regarding icons and iconoclasm and the importance that actual human presence acquires when it comes to revealing the power of both. He says, could it be that the power of icons, like the power of iconoclasm, depends on this presence made intimate? And then he asks, what could be more intimate than destruction? And in my head, when I'm talking to Tausig, I always tell him, well, this disturbingly long kiss, this fleshy and twisting tongue, the thread of saliva precariously connecting the two sets of lips, all of this is far more intimate than destruction. And if this is the case, if the intimacy we witness, and what witnessing means here is far from being straightforward, is material, bodily, erotic rather than destructive, then does this count as iconoclasm or is it something else? Another question that also comes to mind both at the beginning of the video when I see the expression in Castillo's face and at the end when I have often had the chance to see the remnants of disgust and shock and amusement and occasionally also shame in my own face and in the face of those watching with me, who were most recently my students, is one posed by Bruno Latour. What has happened that has made images the focus of so much passion? To the point that destroying them, erasing them, defacing them has been taken as the ultimate touchstone to prove the validity of one's faith, of one's science, of one's critical acumen, of one's artistic creativity. To the point where being an iconoclast seems the highest virtue, the highest piety in intellectual circles. And I think of this question precisely because it links passion to destruction, defacement, erasure, acts that stand in stark contrast with what we see in Castillo's performance. The tender caresses, the excited kissing and licking, the golden face of the icon intact and yet somehow changed. So once again, if neither the passion nor the intimacy translates into act of destruction, it is iconoclasm. I would argue that rather than iconoclasm, this is iconoclash, as conceived by Latour, or what I'm proposing to be an erotic version of that. Iconoclasm, Latour points out, is when we know what is happening in the act of breaking and what the motivations for what appears as a clear project of destruction are. Iconoclash, on the other hand, is when one doesn't know, one hesitates, one is troubled by an action for which there's no way to know without further inquiry whether it is destructive or constructive. In my reading of the emancipatory case, this uncertainty is key, and it is built into the elements of the performance itself. The silence that never gets interrupted and that drags us into an erotic scene we feel should take place behind closed doors. The black void that blends Castillo's body into the background and that, far from being light and empty, weighs heavily on the image as a dimension that can be fully imagined, spelled out in a formula, ignored or dismissed. The slow, sensual movements of the caressing hands, the sucking lips, the wet tongue, and the expectation they trigger in us and that they never fulfill. That the iconoclastic hand will suddenly destroy, deface, erase, that the bus will somehow reciprocate the kiss, or perhaps that the whole thing will just stop already. The hand and the role it plays is another element that for Latour differentiates iconoclash and iconoclasm. Thus, he says, we can define an iconoclash as what happens when there is uncertainty about the exact role of the hand at work in the production of a mediator. Is it a hand with a hammer ready to expose, denounce, debunk, show up, disappoint, disenchant, dispels one's illusions, let the air out? Or is it, on the contrary, a cautious and careful hand, palm turned as if to catch, to elicit, to deuce, to welcome, to generate, to entertain, to maintain, to collect truth and sanctity? In the case of Castillo, this uncertainty is intensified by the fact that the hands disappear from the image, and in their place, there is a tongue, which is neither the hand that made the icon nor the one ready to destroy it. It is instead the rebellious organ that refuses to speak, that doesn't just want a taste of power, because if so, the performance will be much shorter, but rather the satisfaction that comes with unproductive labor, labor that doesn't make or destroy anything, labor that produces saliva and not sweat. The word that insinuates itself and that I keep turning over and over in my mind, desecration, acquires the full materiality of its multifaceted meaning. Desecration as secretion, as the fine threads of saliva forming the unlikely communion between metal and flesh, past and present, dead and alive, stillness and movement, icon and iconoclast turned lover. Desecration as secret, as intimacy unsettling the public space without ever bothering to explain itself. Desecration as surplus. That surplus grabs us, I believe, because it speaks of a double failure. The failure of immanence, of full containment, of the body of power flawlessly holding itself together, no cracks and no leakage. And the failure of transcendence, of not being able to raise above and beyond the materiality that anchors the body to the earth, beyond the most banal of acts and the most ordinary of substances. Castillo makes us witness that failure, see the surplus so close that we can feel it dripping into our hands, and ask, what then do we do with it? And with the potential for subversion that we feel vibrating within it. The answer perhaps is not as important as the question, a question that makes us aware of the reality that something changed, not in Bolivar's face, but in ourselves. We, who thought we were just watching, and who now find ourselves in carnal resonance with Castillo and the icon, be it Bolivar or somebody else. We who must now grapple, whether we want it or not, with our new role as iconoclasters. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irina. And thank you everyone for your wonderful presentations. With this, we are going to transition to the Q&A second part of the panel today. We have around half an hour, 40 minutes for that. We particularly enjoyed the connections and conversations and overlaps between the visual materials that you were presenting and the situations that you were, and the tensions that you were analyzing. So in that line, we thought we could start with these two questions in the chat that point to the connections between the presentations by Maria and by Robert. So Alicia started noticing that in the case of Robert, your presentation about queer Zapata reminded her of the case of Simón Bolívar Gay in Chile, which was a painting of the great liberator, and it created some kind of controversy that could be connected to your case study. And then Rory O'Brien responded to that question by pointing that Lemebel also writes about Juan Dávila's Simón Bolívar, so there could be a connection with Maria. And again, we want to invite you, the people who posed that question, if you want to raise your hands or turn on your videos or unmute yourself, you can always take the opportunity to clarify or expand on those questions. Otherwise, we will pass the word to Maria and Robert.
So thank you for those questions. So sorry, I'm trying to pull up the chat question was the question of like Simón Bolívar Gay in Chile, and how that could make a connection. I actually don't know about that case, so I actually would love to hear if you could send me more information about it. That would be really helpful to think about making these connections.
So just to jump in, Rob, there are a couple of specific questions. There, if you go into the chat, which you may or may not want to jump in and answer. I think there are like the first three. Are the questions visible to you, Rob?
Yes, I just pulled them up now. Sorry, I was trying to find how to pull them up, but yeah, I'm seeing one by Pablo Ben here.
Yeah.
Well, actually, thank you, Pablo. I actually have been meaning to write you because I've loved your article on plebeian masculinity for so long, and I've been meaning to write you about that. So I'm seeing here like queer art has usually been transgressive. In the case of Zapata, the queer image, Zapata was presented as an institutional image, and the protesters are the transgressors. Yeah, so actually I'm borrowing a lot from Juana Maria Rodriguez, who writes on bisexual erasure. And at the end, there is this kind of notion that re-recognizing bisexuality as more than just adding the B to LGBT, but actually engaging with bisexual politics, really promises to return that kind of transgressive lens to queerness by reaffirming commitments to feminist and anti-racist political demands. So sexual autonomy, prison rights, sex work, limited state recognition of other forms of kinship, and kind of engaging with bisexual politics enables this kind of broad alliances across race and gender that are necessary for sexual politics. And I think for me, one of the things that thinking with a bisexual lens has really helped me think through is this question of sexual asceticism during revolutionary struggle, this kind of glorification of like the rejection of sexual desire during revolutionary struggle. And it makes me think of not just like new sexualities in terms of asexuality in those instances, and thinking about the politics of asexuality, but also like the fact that maybe not make the asceticism laudatory in the accounts of revolutionary struggle, but also simply the fact that like maybe you were not sexually attracted to anyone in your cell or who you were in revolutionary struggle with, right? Like thinking about bisexual desire is not simply that thinking of like the rejection of sexuality at certain times of revolutionary struggle, not simply as a result of like the need for political struggle. So that's one way that I've kind of been thinking about like returning the transgressive to queerness. I hope that answers the question.
Perfect. So we'll just keep moderating a few of the questions here, and then both Javier and I have questions for the panelists as well. So there's a question here from Johan Gotero Osorio for Inés, and it's in Spanish. I'll read it in Spanish and then offer a translation, but it says, Hola Inés, excelente presentación. Al ponerse el dildo para violar los símbolos, la artista refuerza sin proponérselo el lugar del falo como posición de poder. And basically just excellent presentation, Inés. By using a dildo to violate these symbols and, violar, violate in quotes, does the artist reinforce, perhaps without meaning to, the place of the phallus in a positionality of power?
Hola, Johan, ¿qué tal? I know Johan actually from years ago. We did study together the first 2 years at Boston, and I believe he's in Chicago now. ¿Contesto en español o en inglés? Zeb, ¿qué piensas?
It's up to you.
En inglés puede ser, no hay problema.
Okay. That's a very good question, actually, because I did question the same thing when I watched the video for the first time. And I think I want to take the risk and say that I think it was on purpose. The dildo is also white. It's not, it doesn't have a different color. And I think it's maybe as a fuck you back for what you've done, as a revenge. And the thing is, I was thinking of the dildo as a technology, as an instrument, the same way it's been presented in Paul Preciado Contra-Sexual Manifesto or Testo Yonki, where the dildo is used in non-normative way. So you can think of the dildo also as an instrument that is breaking the norm, because it's not a human organ. It is added to the body. And I think it also, in that way, goes against the idea that only only a biologically male person can be the penetrator. So if you think of the dildo as an instrument, the idea of the phallus is not necessarily attached. The idea of power is not just attached to a biologically male person. It can be appropriated to a different person that doesn't have a penis. So I think in that way, it is a tricky, I think, tool, because it does bring this question, but at the same time, it does have a subvertive proposition with the fact that it's not biological and that it can be used for a different purpose. I hope I answered.
Perfect. So there are a couple of other questions rolling in. There are one or two other ones for Rob, but I'm going to jump in with a question because part of what I really, really loved about these 4 papers are in part the ways that they dialogue with one another, especially around radical redefinitions of that which is obscene, pornographic, and this is always sort of in relation to visibility or invisibility. So a question sort of for Maria and also for Irina. I love how both of you are pushing, on notions of the obscene, whether or not it's stated as such. And I think, Maria, you sort of walk us through the obscenity in terms of the body, in terms of, grotesqueness, but also obscenity itself as state violence, as excess, a sort of political excess or a dictatorial excess. And Irina, I think, your concept of your use of iconoclash and the destruction and the intimacies and productive intimacies, I think are doing something different. I mean, something very similar in terms of how something that, as you show, is not, there's nothing particularly pornographic about the artist kissing this material object, right? But the ways the pornographic accrues, or the obscenity of it accrues largely through forms of circulation and the ways that information come to accrue to that act, right? And sort of affect occurring to that act. So I guess my question for both of you is, how does obscenity or pornography speak to questions of excess and sort of challenge any idea that the obscene is something that is necessarily hidden, invisible, and eroticized? I think both of your visions of the obscene are sort of pointing to something different. Like the obscene is no longer that which is no longer hidden. The obscene is that which is becomes all too visible, despite the fact that it might be sort of divorced from sex, from certain forms of corporeality that could be described as pornographic. That was long-winded, but yeah.
I can go unless Irina, si quieres ir primero, it's up to you.
I'll go only because I also have a question for you. So maybe you can answer a question while I answer my question. We're all answering questions.
For sure.
Thank you so much, Seb, for your question. And again, I love being in this panel because the connections are insane and they are constantly showing up. I think that the obscene in the context of Deborah Castillo's work functions in 2 ways. In a way, it brings out the obscene of the cult of the father of the fatherland. That's what becomes obscene when it's rendered material or rendered to an extreme in which what we think is only metaphorical, what we think is only simile, what we think is about words and the kitschy performance of the state becomes actually a point of contact with those people who have become so used to hearing this that we lose the sense of how this obsession or this focus can become not just detrimental in terms of the limits of power, but also to the way we think about ourselves. So I think there is an obscenity to that, but I think the other excess that is in the performance, and I like to think about, especially when I saw Inez's, the video that you provide, Inez, because it's just so similar and so different, but I think the excess in this case is that is low uncertainty, that thing that we're uncomfortable, but I don't know exactly why, which my students remind me often when I show them this, that activates for me something in those who watch it. So and that I'm going a little bit with Susanna Passonen's idea of cardinal resonance. I think the performance brings it back to you. So you find yourself in a relationship that you didn't bargain for. And you find yourself activated by an energy that is on the image but doesn't stay on the image. So that is what becomes perhaps obscene to me, like that return of the image to yourself and then back to the image in a way to question that relationship. And I'm just gonna end with that, but just quickly ask Maria, like when I read the material that you posted, and I know, I don't know, like if you're thinking about this, but one thing that stood out to me were the illustrations that were on the pages. And I know they're illustrated by somebody else, but like, it just, to me, they spoke a lot of that excess too, as if like the page was like throwing up something on itself. And I just, in terms of archive, but also in terms of like image and the word, I was just curious if you had thought about that or if you bring into your analysis. Okay, now I'll shut up.
Thank you so much, Irina and Seb. I'll start with Seb's question. There's 7 short stories in total, and when I was trying to select, I mean, I'm interested in all of them, and all of them are are different. You have a story where this Santa Claus, who's basically a homeless man, is trying to rape a young girl. A Monsignor who's trying to, also in a way of helping a young woman that's in the middle of a protest, brings her in and in this weird way starts praying with her as he undresses her. Like all of these really like graphic, very obscene, stories. But I chose these 2 because they're different. They are not graphic. They're not excessive. They're excessive in how destitute the characters are. Like what's excessive is how these characters are just kind of left to die. They're not memorable in the same way that other characters would be memorable. And that in itself, I think, shows a different version of dictatorial state violence that we don't normally see when we're thinking about there's so much cultural products that come after Pinochet's dictatorship that these 2 stories function in a slightly different way. They're not about, military personnel torturing someone. It's not about, which happens all of the time, right? It's not about death in this way. It's about just everyday people that are in such a precarious situation that's what's excessive. It's how destitute they are. And that's why they're so unforgettable, right? The vieja who's just left to die, whose body is not found for 3 years or 3 months after she's dead in her apartment, right? And so that to me is what is almost like hard to read. Like when they're really short, they're just 1-pagers, as you can see. That's what's difficult to kind of grasp, more than outright violence, more than outright, sexual excess. And that in itself feels really grotesque. And so that's what intrigues me about these 2 particular stories, that pushes my understanding of obscenity. And in the larger work, I'm thinking about actual like obscenity law, like what is it that things are it's censored as being obscene, and why this particular work, which easily could have had Lemebel killed because they were, printed and passed through. They were passed during protests. That's why they were in little bundles, so they would just be passed separately. They were also kind of sold in front of feminist bookstores. And so that in itself, because I'm interested in the risk of why they weren't necessarily seen or placed Lemebel as a threat, right? What is it that it hides that the military doesn't flag immediately as a threat, right? And it's because the critiques of the regime are also mixed with just these, characters and the language that's being used. And that's kind of the strategy that Lemebel has always used. So that's what interests me. Part of that is also the illustrations. Yeah, the illustrations are done by different artists. And so, in the whole collection, I think there's different artists that actually drew the originals, and you see a little bit of that. And I don't go too much into it, though I want to think about what it does. And one of the short stories that I do analyze in my larger work was also turned into a graphic novel with the work of Lemaitre. Like he's like, this is such a visual, he was thinking always visually, and I think his language is always visual, that he wanted it to be a graphic novel. And so I am interested a little bit in, especially the vieja that kind of is like, peeking into the page, and just the way that she's constantly described, like the whole story is about her body, her description, her legs, her skirt, you know, los ojos de gallina, like all of these very grotesque descriptions of this woman. That is what makes up the majority of the story. And so I think that that's part of also the image of creating her. The whole story is about us imagining this woman and this woman's body in this really, like, you know, I say grotesque way, that kinds of makes us question, right? How is it that we're thinking about desire? What is desire? Why do these young men desire her? Why is she still the thing that comes up as desire ongoing? And what does it say about our conceptions of what we hide, what we don't say, of our own adolescent desires that we hid or didn't hide? And so those are the things that I'm interested in those stories.
Thank you both so much. I really love the ways that you both of your responses sort of bring us to the visceral at a sort of like personal level, but also at a kind of political and state level. So this is really exciting. Just to say, we probably only have about 12 minutes left, though I imagine we could keep the conversation going on for quite a while. So we're just going to go straight back to some of the questions and comments that have been rolling in. Ivan Aguirre doesn't have a question per se, but I just wanted to read this comment. It says, amazing panel. Thank you to everyone for a great Friday morning. Ines and Irina, thank you for giving me other ways to understand pleasure as political and resistance. And I was just about to comment / ask about the Manifiesto contra Sexual tied to the use of the dildo. So we have a couple of other questions. Javier will moderate for a sec from a few people. And then we have a question that just came in from Julia Cheng.
So I'm going to ask my question myself, then I'm going to ask Joaquin to unmute himself to present another question for Rolf. And then we have a question from Julia to Irina. So we are going to collect the 3 questions together before getting back to the panel. So my question for Maria was about one strategy that you mentioned Lemaitre was using, the assumption of naivete, the assumption that the military officers or the censors were in a way naive about the hidden or coded meanings of the work. And I was wondering how much that assumption was accurate, whether it was like a real reflection on the naivete of the censors, and how much we can assume that naivete is something that continues into the present, or rather there is more of an awareness on the part of pro-censorship or reactionary sectors about the kind of coded meanings or strategies that we are using to contest hegemonic constructions of gender and sexuality. And I'm going to ask Joaquín. Joaquín, te pido que digas la pregunta en español si quieres.
¿Qué tal? Bueno, puedo seguir en inglés, pero me cuesta un poco hablar en español, en inglés, así que voy a preguntar en español. Primero les agradezco las presentaciones que disfruté mucho, y con respecto a la presentación de Robert, me quedé pensando en cuál es el papel de la censura en la regulación del mercado. ¿Cómo funciona el mercado a todo esto? Si es justo la censura la que convierte a estas obras en mercancías y regula el valor, el valor de ellas, los precios. ¿Cuál es el papel del mercado a todo esto? Bueno, muchas gracias.
And then we have a couple of questions from Julia. Julia, I don't know if you prefer me to unmute you so you can pose the questions, or I can paraphrase them.
I can say them. Well, this has been an amazing panel. I feel so engaged. This is wonderful. So when Ines, when you were answering the question about the dildo in as a kind of form of masculine power, I really appreciated your answer and your engagement with Preciado and her Manifesto Contra Sexual. And I haven't read that book in a while, but I remember all the drawings of the different body parts that could be a dildo. Like it could be a forearm, or I think it was even the head. She like circles the head and like, or the whole body could be a dildo. And so I was wondering about the obscenity in the video that Irina analyzed. And I was wondering, Irina, if you were, can we think about this bust of Bolivar? It's such a weird shot, you know, because it's just these two heads. And I was really left thinking about that, this kind of the lack of the body, and yet it's so obscene. And so I was like, does the bust get reappropriated as a kind of a dildo, or the head as a kind of dildo? And also because it's gold and shiny, it's just there's something very aesthetically excessive and dense about that. And then I had another question about Robert. It's so much of this outrage about Zapata's, you know, possible bisexuality. It just reminds me of some of the early debates in the 90s of certain Chicana feminists trying to claim Sor Juana as a kind of lesbian mestiza, you know, foremother, and then Octavio Paz saying there was no way she was, but, you know, like lesbian. And I'm wondering if there's a kind of parallel there with like the state investment in these national icons and their sexuality.
So yeah, I definitely, and I'm remembering the depiction of Sor Juana in the film Yo las peores de todo. That was the film, right? Where she kisses through the kind of bars there. So yeah, there's kind of, I think this ties a little bit into Joaquin's, and actually I noticed in the chat, Luis Vargas Santiago also asked a question. I don't know if they're still in the audience, and Luis was actually the curator of the exhibit. So I should definitely tie that in that, you know, he's asking that, would people be more comfortable with a bisexual conception of Zapata as long as he was still presented as this like cis macho male, right? And I actually think that ties into, I didn't get much into it, but the piece itself, right? It's doing a lot for the kind of bisexual representation that I'm writing about, because it's emphasizing his bronze skin, right? It doesn't whitewash him in the way that other works do. And it's presenting him in a position that's almost embracing that carnal sexual desire, right? Like it looks like he's about to engage in anal sex, right? So it kind of really is emphasizing that bisexual desire that Zapata may have potentially had. And Joaquín, te voy a tener que contestar en inglés porque en español voy a, o sea, todos van a sufrir si trato de contestar en español. That yes, I think 100%. It's interesting you ask, in the chat, you asked, did other paintings get sold? I don't know if other paintings got sold, but interestingly, the total amount of paintings in the exhibit were 141. And as everyone knows, as I wrote, like the number 41 in Mexico carries such resonance, right? So it's interesting that there was a choice to include 141 pieces of Zapata artwork, kind of acknowledging, it's like, you know, wink, wink, nod, nod. And I think 100% the censorship played a role, because that's actually what Bennett says when he bought it, right? He's like, he bought it specifically because it was censored and because it caused such scandal in Mexico. And this piece now it traveled to Barcelona. It's now in Barcelona. So it enters this transnational queer conversation of transgression. And it's part of his collection of 70 pieces that he considers also transgressive work. So works by like Robert Mapplethorpe are in this collection. So this idea of censorship transgression added value to the work and really made Chet like a very well-known now artistic figure in the kind of international art market. And it led to a bidding war. Like the price has never been disclosed, but you can imagine, because the New York MoMA wanted to purchase it, and I think they were about to purchase it first, and then a Spanish billionaire comes in with an undisclosed price and buys the piece. So I think 100% the censorship and the scandal played a role in the value of the piece.
Okay, I was going to answer Julia's question. Julia, thank you so much for your question and for being here. I hadn't thought of it like that, but I do have to say that the way she uses these figures does relate to her own, to a pleasure that is complicated, because what you see through her trajectory as an artist, and obviously I can't show all of it here, but the next stage is she's actually gonna actively masturbate the nose of a caudillo that remains nameless. Then she's gonna use his arms to like touch herself. And then eventually she's gonna slap him until the bust falls into the ground. So you can read it a little bit like that. But in a way, I say that the pleasure is complicated because she has also talked about, and we can imagine the grossness of the contact of the surfaces. Like when I see that, and the fact that there's no noise, I think contributes to that. It's like it brings you exactly to the tongue as the point of concentration, but also you start asking weird questions like, what does that taste like? Which then brings you to a question like, what does Bolivar taste like? And she does a performance in this same exhibit where she gives the audience these machetes made of chocolate. So you see the people actually sucking the machetes, which are this one's not made of chocolate. But so I guess my point is that through this instrument, what it allows you to do is precisely ask questions that sound wrong because it has to do with these figures of power. And they sound wrong because icons shouldn't have taste or texture or cracks or leakage. And so that is, I think, how we read sort of the deconstructive power of that, like, so, but thank you so much.
I wanted to answer Javier's question that you posed on thinking about how accurate is, the assumption that, anyone connected to the military regime was naive enough to not really understand what was being written. There was heavy censorship in Chile to anyone that spoke out against the regime, so I don't think we'll really know. I do think that the strategy of passing them down individually and not as a collection protects a lot of, it's a political strategy to protect the author, right? Like they don't connect to each other. I think collectively they read very differently than if you just read one. It feels odd to just read one. You don't know where the story came from, like why? And I also think that part of, the Lemevel's use of queerness, of sexuality, of obscenity also provides protection, even if it doesn't seem that way. I think it's why, it's both like an accusation and a form of protection for not assuming that queer revolutionaries can be threatening. I think we see that in his work with Manifiesto and Yeguas of Apocalipsis. He's like, I'm more macho than you because I've had to endure way more than you, though you don't see me as that way, right? You don't see me as a threat, but I'm very much a threat. And so I think that that's also part of what is, it's not so much that, whoever might have been reading this would not flag them. I think it's seen as not threatening, and I think that that's what we see in characters like the Vieja and Prometeo. They're presumed to be non-threatening, and that is where their threat lies, to have the ability to speak out against the regime. And so I think that that's what leads Lemebel to also then kind of move along with his work and performance, but also they were published under his paternal name, Pedro Mardones, which was also his father's name. And him and his father have been confused before. And so Pedro Lemebel, when he published his first short story, he won a prize, and his dad was interviewed because they thought he wrote the story, and the dad gave the interview not knowing what was happening. And so Lemebel talks about how his dad basically like in the newspaper like received a prize and took a picture and did an interview on like a very oddly queer story that Lemebel wrote, not knowing what he was talking about. And so I think that also kind of plays it into thinking of all these like small ways that people are able to strategize and create and spaces of resistance with a strategic place on queerness and sexuality that is often taken for granted. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Maria. Thank you everyone for your wonderful responses. We are gonna wrap up because we are approaching the 2 p.m. Time limit that we set. First, we wanted to thank everyone who attended, especially the panelists for their wonderful, engaging, and exciting presentations. This is a great beginning for the conversations that we are going to continue through the special issue. We encourage you to keep your eyes open for other events and materials that we will be sharing in connection with that. So with that, I pass the word to Seth.
Yeah, just to reiterate exactly what Javier said on the part of the Journal of Latin American Cultural Studies editorial board. Thank you all the audience members and especially the 4 panelists for what we thought was a fabulous and really fascinating, productive conversation. It was an absolute honor to have all of you here with us. And this concludes our 2021 Pandemonio, and we look forward to hopefully in-person meetings and reuniones in the future. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It was so nice meeting you all.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Sí.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you. Stay safe, please, everyone.
Bye-bye.